We are here for a special edition of Standard Deviation, a new YouTube playlist that Charles inspired me to do because he was talking in the episode that we recorded, and that's going to air on June 15th. And we're talking about the fact that his presentation skills are mostly, like show and tell, so demos. Charles, thanks so much for coming back here today to do this with me.
Excited to be here. Let's have some fun.
Yeah, I'm excited too. So, like, a lot of things happened in the last 7 days with Google Analytics for a lot of news and announcements I've seen.
I think we had some privacy updates, some new features, and obviously Google making all their announcements. So not a boring day for sure.
Yeah, I saw the conversion migration tool. I saw the announcement this morning. But I want to take it back from the beginning. I asked the people on my LinkedIn and on Twitter and on our networks, and I realized that most of the questions that come about Google Analytics 4, even if it's something that exists for some years, like it's been in development for some years, there's still a lot of unclarity when it comes to GA4, aka the future of analytics, as Google names it. So one of the questions that came for this episode from the podcast network was pretty straightforward. And someone said, how is it better than universal analytics? Like, what are the main differences? And I'm trying to take a very neutral stance as a moderator here, so I'm not gonna, say what opinions I have. But I guess my question is it really fair or effective for us to try to understand GA4 by comparing it with universal analytics?
It's important to note that the product is still under heavy development. And we just talked about that, right? Like this week, there's all these new things that just popped up. And a lot of this is brand new features and functionality. And I think it's also important to note that what a lot of people might not realize is nothing's really changed with universal analytics in probably 2 to 3 years. There really hasn't been any new features. There really hasn't been any changes in the UI. And it's not until you rewind probably 5 years ago or more until that stuff started to happen. Like I used to remember when I would do trainings on the current version of Google Analytics, like it would change in the middle of my training. And that hasn't happened in a significant amount of time. So on the GA4 side, there's just a lot of things Google's still working on, I think, to polish it, to make it better, to make it more useful. And I feel what is causing a little bit of frustration right now is if you have this expectation that GA4 is fully ready and that you can use it instead of universal right now, you're probably going to end up being pretty frustrated in the experience. So, and we talked about this, I think, on our last talk. Personally, I'm still spending 90% plus of my time in the old version. It's still my day-to-day tool. And I'm mostly investing my time in implementing GA4, building some domain knowledge, maybe using it for a few new features or cool analysis I can do. But even myself, I'm waiting for new features and functionality and ease of use to come. And my hope is between now and July of next year that we start to see all of that from Google. So I think before we talk about like feature differences and what's better about GA4, I think we just have to take that huge step back and realize it's too early really to do apples to apples because the GA4 product isn't what I would consider complete yet, if that makes sense.
100%. And like exactly as we were chatting in the beginning, the fact that there's constant updates, there's constant changes and announcements shows that this is something that people at Google are in the community around Google are actively working on and trying to make it better. Another question that was interesting and funny to me was how marketers really love those real-time analytics. For me, real-time analytics is not, and I'm trying to be a neutral person, but I legit remember reading a post on LinkedIn this week about how someone said that they just like to sit there and watch the real-time analytics in universal analytics. So like, how's the real-time working in GA4? Like, can you show us like where will marketers be able to look now?
So that's all. I mean, this whole thing about real time is also a little interesting to me because a lot of us that have been using it a lot many of us know that it's actually been broken for probably over a year now. Real-time and universal has had consistent issues, and on Measure Slack, like I feel like I've been posting over and over again, like I just don't trust it. I don't have any confidence in it. And for whatever reason, it doesn't seem until like 2 to 4 weeks ago that it finally like really broke. But anyways, it's been broken for quite some time, and I think a lot of people don't realize that. So on the GA4 side, the exciting part is supposed to be that it's actually functional. It's going to solve whatever processing or engineering deficiencies that Google's not able to fix. And it should just be a lot more reliable. And then when we talk about potential, Google's made real-time in GA4 have a lot more functionality than what it had in the current version. So previously, you weren't really able to do real-time audiences or really get into a lot of the dimensionality of your custom dimensions. That wasn't even available. And GA4 offers that. So the hope is over time, we get some really cool use cases and enhancements with GA4 where you should have everything. But I think what's challenging for right now is, since I think this Google announcement of deprecation caught a lot of people by surprise, unfortunately, a lot of marketers don't have it implemented. So they're just frustrated because they can't go over to GA4 and they can't really explore those real-time use cases. And then in addition, there was lots of plugins and kind of third-party community type stuff that made use of real-time. And it's still, again, early. A lot of people haven't built that yet for GA4. So we should see a lot of improvements on that end in the months to come for sure.
Yeah, that sounds good. I never trusted the real-time analytics either. And I just think, like Tim Wilson was saying something similar. It's just like we're so obsessed with causation and to see things happen, like just so we can get an answer as marketers, because we're so desperate to find that why and oh, look at this is working. That, like we just stop forget, and we kind of forget about the engineering part of it and the fact that, it's been addressed not only on Measure, because not everybody is on Measure Slack, but also there's been a lot of, Twitter conversations about this. And I think it's very important right now, in my opinion, as a marketer that I am, that we definitely need to educate ourselves more, even if we don't have to do the integration, because not all of us know how to do it. But it's just good to know the components and, the main differences, because otherwise we're just going to end up, repeating the same mistakes that we did with universal analytics.
And
So, go ahead.
I was just going to say one other thing on that. Another thing I think people don't realize is you hit a really important point. No one's really doing anything with that real-time stuff. The closest thing you could say to any real use is like lobby dashboards or like some dashboard for your marketing team, but no one is doing it. It's something cool you might look at when a campaign launches or you have a TV ad and you get to see the big spike of traffic. But let's be honest, no one's using it. And more importantly, if we talk about GA4 from real time, Google's actually given everyone a huge, really powerful new feature, and it's related to that BigQuery integration. And in the new BigQuery integration, where you can get access to the raw data, there's streaming data in there. And that streaming data is actually faster than it is in the paid version of Google Analytics, GA360 today. So previously, the fastest you could get data in your data warehouse was every 10 to 15 minutes. And in GA4, even in the free version, it's now somewhere between within seconds to sub, depending on what documentation you read. But basically within a minute, that data shows up in your marketing data warehouse. So if we're talking about real time, I feel like most marketers think of activating or doing something with that data in real time. And that's what Google's just unlocked. You can potentially build your own customer data platform using your first party kind of clickstream data from GA4 as the core. So as an example, if someone's logged in or authenticated into your site and something happens and you have a user ID for that user, you can, in BigQuery, actually activate that and send some sort of marketing campaign or put them in an audience or send them an email, or even try hooking that into your site and personalizing that experience for that user. So on that side, again, huge potential. None of that functionality is native or out yet, but that's giving you a taste of hopefully what's to come with GA4 or could come.
For sure. And I definitely want you to maybe share your screen later once we, go through these little questions. to just like show people how this, BigQuery integration looks like, just so they can get an idea, because I think it's one of the most powerful features, in my opinion, as a person that heavily, is interested in those, behavioral patterns in data. So someone, Irina, was saying, where can someone actually get started? She said, can you explain what is missing versus the old version and what was added? I'm neutral again. She said that she's using it to check cart abandonment, but also page views after search. And she wants to know what value does the new version is adding in terms of granularity. And we kind of touched on that right now.
Yeah, so I mean, I can show some of this now. So if we kind of look through this, I would say the part I struggle with personally most in GA4 right now is probably the UI. And my hope is that between now again and July of next year and even beyond, that we start to see some pretty drastic changes to this UI. We need some new features to make it more flexible. I think we need Google to revisit some of the graphs and charts and how we actually interact with the data. So if I pick a better place, like some of these traffic acquisition reports, I find just aren't really helpful by default, like this bar chart and this graph, and I can't really plot rows. And anyways, I find it limiting. So there's some cool stuff in GA4 where you can actually customize this, but I'm hoping simply we get a better default experience. And I feel like if I switch accounts, since we're talking e-commerce, what I was going to say is I feel like I especially feel that on the e-commerce side. So if I go over to this demo account, so all of you could use this demo account. Google has a free demo that you can just Google GA4 demo account. And on the e-commerce side, I think I find that especially true, where I feel like we need better, kind of more sophisticated reports, either in the standard reports or in the explorations. So personally, I would say right now, I'm finding I have to do a lot of that in BigQuery, or I'm doing what I said before. I'm going back and I'm doing my e-commerce analysis in Universal, because I'm not able to really get what I need out of the e-com reports right now. So hopefully, again, we see some pretty substantial improvements. The theme behind all of this is going to be that the implementation of the data model behind it is fairly complete at this point. So meaning you're not going to have to go and change your e-commerce implementation later, but we're kind of following that theme of dual tagging. So tag both, collect the data with all the e-commerce, so that, next year in April, May, or June, when you start switching over to GA4, at that point, you'll have the new features and everything you need and all the historical data to do exactly the type of analysis you were trying to do at that point. But right now, things like that are going to be a little bit challenging in GA4 for sure.
But again, it's just the beginning. It's too early, but I'm sure the more time passes, and I think, again, a lot of people need to come with patience, to GA4, and don't expect to simply replace everything. And I think a perception that happens, and I've seen a lot, is just that people don't understand that you have to use this time until next July to get this historical data going, to train and get accustomed with GA4, but not drop universal analytic like that. It's a transition. I want to talk a bit about, this was another question, let's talk a bit about the data model GA4 is using, because it's fundamentally the biggest difference between GA4 and universal analytics. And Peblaya was actually asking this, related to this. He said, will the most important, and he said, I mean useless metrics like bounce rate and time on site remain as it is?
Yeah, so the data model's changed, and I feel like while you could say it's a lot different than Universal, it also really isn't, because we track things in Universal as either page views or events, and they're different data types, and they did have different schemas. And when we talk about GA4, when people say the data model is different, what's changed is it's an event-driven data model. So everything's an event. So if we take a huge step back, the big change between Universal and GA4 is basically in the raw data, or basically how all the data was built and collected. In Universal, it was sessionized. So everything was grouped into visits or sessions at the data model layer. So that meant, like, if you were to actually look at the raw data, every row was actually a session, and then all the interactions were nested within a single row. So what's changed about GA4 is they got rid of the sessionization of making everything session centric, and they've made it event centric. So in the actual raw data, if you set up your BigQuery integration, you'll actually see that each row inside your data is an event. So a page use an event, an events event, everything is basically built at an event layer. And that's what's changed. And this is what is modernizing Google Analytics, is now it's more user-centric or event-centric, where previously it was session-centric, which nothing else in the marketing world is organized around sessions really, other than Google Analytics, just because of how it was kind of uniquely built. So this is what is modernized, and this should start giving us a lot of flexibility and a lot of really cool things to do. But for the question that's being asked, a lot of that's still going to be around. So bounce rate was just announced that it's coming back into the platform. Bounce rate is basically going to be the inverse of engagement rate, which we have here. And I know a lot of people have bones to pick with vanity metrics, but at the end of the day, a lot of marketers just want simple metrics to measure how performance is. So are things better or worse? How is a landing page? So I actually like some of these vanity metrics, and I feel like they do have a purpose and there's ways to use them, especially if you think of a maturity curve. When you're on the beginning part of your journey into becoming an analyst, those metrics can be pretty helpful. And then as soon as you get more sophisticated or advanced, you kind of leave those behind. And I think that's important to note, that a lot of people are still getting into analytics for the first time. They're implementing it on a business they're starting for the first time. So I might differ in my opinion a little bit and say, I'm actually glad bounce rate is coming back and some of these other metrics. My hope is that Google can give us more customization around making them as customized as we want for everyone's specific needs. But at the end of the day, I think having them is actually going to provide some value and use. And then for the power users, like the others at CXL, Google's giving us the ability to customize these reports. So if bounce rate annoys you, then you can actually customize this report in this library feature over here. And I clicked in the wrong place, but if I click this library feature over here, you could actually come in, go into a particular report, like this landing page report I built, and you could say, you know what, I don't want the bounce rate at all, so I'm just going to remove it as a dimension. So I could just axe it in my dimensions or my metrics. So here I picked user sessions and views. And if I didn't want views, I just hit the X, and now it's not a metric in my report anymore. So that's a fun way of showing you. You can have your vanity metrics or you can't. Google's just giving you the option.
That's really cool. And I like the fact that you started the talking about reporting, because I follow you on Twitter, and I noticed you were very, I don't know, because vocal sounds pejorative. It doesn't have to be like you were very passionate. I think that's the correct way to say it, about a challenge that occurs in the Google Analytics for reporting, and that's cardinality. What is cardinality and why should we avoid it? Let's talk a bit about that, because I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah, so I am personally experiencing something challenging in my larger implementations. So these are going to probably be my mid-market and like enterprise customers. So anyways, customers with more sophisticated needs. And there's a challenge right now around cardinality that these customers and myself are experiencing. And if you're not familiar with that term, cardinality is basically what Google and other platforms do when a certain dimension has lots of different values. So if you think of something like a page right here, we're saying that we have 1,559 unique page titles. And if we were to switch this to like page path, we instantly see this jump up to 10,000, right? And so how many pages does our website have? Is it 1,500? Is it 10,000? So things like this, where we look at URLs, these query parameters are actually causing us to have more URLs than we actually have pages, because it's treating each unique entry and each query parameter as its own page. So previously in Google Analytics, what Google would do is it would give you basically 50,000 of the top rows by how many sessions you had. And then everything else, it would group into a row called other. And the reason Google does that is because all of us want our data and our reports to load very fast. And there's always a trade-off, right? The larger the table, the more rows, the more dimensions, the more calculations it has to do, the more time it's going to take for something to actually load in the UI. So to ensure Google Analytics generally loads fast is at least primarily one of the reasons cardinality exists. It's kind of a trade-off. Now, it was still pretty useful and universal because, again, it would give you basically your top 50,000 rows, and you could still say this was my top page, these are my top 10 pages, and you could trend everything as well. If I pop over to Twitter, I can just show the issue that you were mentioning, and that's basically right now. GA4 does something very different with cardinality, and if I just get to the core of the issue, right now there's two core issues. First of all, cardinality actually affects everything right now. So previously in Universal, it would only affect the dimension that had lots of values. So if you had lots of pages, then that particular dimension might have other, but it's not going to impact your device category and your channel groups and your attribution. All that's still fully going to be available. What's different in GA4 is if you have any one dimension that has tons of cardinality, like maybe you capture a user ID in a custom dimension, or you have tons of query parameters, or maybe you tracked a bunch of site speed metrics. Something like that at a certain point could cause GA4 to start having cardinality. And the really negative thing right now is that in the standard reports, once that happens, it affects everything. It doesn't just affect the single dimension you're looking at, but it also starts to affect other dimensions. So if I pop over to, I think, my media, I have an example of this where in this particular account, I have, again, lots of pages. I have some custom dimensions that are very chatty, and it's actually causing the default device category report to be aggregated. This isn't what a lot of people would expect Google Analytics to do. And then the bigger issue that I'm also experiencing related to this is that when we start to compare the unaggregated data, because you can go to the explorations section of Google Analytics. So in Google Analytics, we also talked about this. There's two completely different reporting modules. There's a standard reports, and then there's explore. The standard reports are always unsampled, but they're pretty limited in what you can do with them. And then explore is basically free form, ad hoc analysis, way more powerful, a lot more things you can do with it, but it's potentially sampled. And then it's limited in kind of how much data it can actually use from a data retention perspective. So the cardinality issue right now isn't really impacting the explore reports. It's mostly impacting the standard reports. And my issue is if I do the same report in both places, I get completely different data. And that's what this is showing. So here's where the cardinality is happening in the standard report using device category and channel group. And then in my exploration report, I pulled the same report, and not only do the rows not match, so the totals aren't matching in between these, the top 10 list is different. And then even the total metrics at the top aren't aligned. Wow. So there's just something, what I would say, very wrong happening. And I think CMO pointed this out. It's not an issue with the data because in the back end, everything's being collected in BigQuery and in Google's raw tables correctly. It's kind of what CMO said was a reporting problem. It's basically how Google's applying cardinality in GA4 doesn't really make sense. And in fact, for me, it's causing me to have a lack of confidence in my standard reports when this does happen. So basically, if we do a too long didn't read summary of this, GA4 basically is a giant pivot table. So if any one dimension is very chatty, GA4 is going to cause every dimension to be chatty because it's not storing individual reports like how it did in Universal Analytics. Instead, it's just one big table. So my hope is that by highlighting this issue, I've been trying to work with Google to get this addressed for some time, and I know some others in the community have. But my hope is that by highlighting this, we start to see some improvements again. And if those improvements do happen, it should be retroactive since it's a reporting problem. So I think Google can address this, and I hope Google can address it. But at least right now, it's one of my biggest pain points in GA4. And I have some customers that are really struggling with this. And it's another reason that I just go back. I'm still spending most of my time in Universal because certain things like this are causing GA4 to be a little bit more challenging than it should be right now. At least that's my take on it.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, it makes you trust it less because you don't know. And data should inform your decisions and it should sustain your decisions. So obviously you won't be able to, or like if you don't notice this and you present these reports to your bosses or whatever, the data is not wrong, but the reporting is wrong. Like that's the thing. Yeah, this is crazy. I had no idea about this. This is such a good, like, one of those videos that you should bite size. Then I will do that for social media. I had no idea, and it's crazy. I would also like someone, let me see. Let's talk about, this is the comment. Let's talk about the conversion migration tool for Google Analytics 4. And someone said, can you show us what it looks like and how it works?
Yeah, so there's a new conversion migration tool. We can pop over to that. So basically the way this is going to work is in GA4, there's something called the setup assistant. And if we go into the setup assistant, if you've linked your GA4 property to a universal property, then what's going to happen is this feature is going to be available. So let me pop over to Universal real quick and see if I can find this. So if I switch over to Universal, and in Universal, let's see, I'm still not switched. If I go to my Universal property, in here, there's a GA4 setup assistant. And in your Universal property, if you have both in the same account, you can link Universal to GA4. And then once you have it linked, basically what happens is Google can start to have the ability to potentially share different configuration settings at the admin level between both. So now if I switch over to GA4, since I've linked my universal to my GA4 because they're both in the same property, what's going to happen is there's going to be in the conversion section, there should be a setup assistant here. So in this particular section, let me switch. Maybe that's not the right place. Let me try this one. I'm hoping I can pull it up quickly. Otherwise, we can just talk about it. So settings, let's try setup assistant. And then perfect. This one I have linked successfully. So anyways, this might happen to you. If you don't see this the first time you go in here, it's because you haven't linked your GA4 to your universal. So anyways, once I click get started, this is how this feature works, is basically it's going to grab your goals from your universal analytics account, and it's going to give you the option to map these into GA4. So it's grabbing all of my goals, and you can see I have 13 different of those. And then in here, you can define what the conversion event name is. It's giving you a preview of what the match rules are. And then you can go through and you can save this and import it. And this is going to highlight a brand new feature in GA4. So what's happening is GA4 has a new feature called Create Events. And if you haven't heard of this feature, what this feature does is the Create Event feature is new functionality that allows GA4 to create events from other events from the UI. So it's kind of complicated.
Cool. No, but it's cool.
So let me give you an example. So I'll take a big step back. Let's say we're setting up GA4 for the first time, and you want to create a conversion for anytime someone views your blog. Well, the problem is the conversion tracking is at an event level. So you can mark an event as a conversion, but you can't filter what certain dimension of that event you want to be the conversion. So I can say that I want all of my page views to be a conversion, but there's no feature here to say, well, let me specify which page, like a thank you page or a blog page or a careers page. That's not an option. So the reason it's not an option is because of this cool feature called create event. And what create event does is you can come in and say, I want to actually create a new event. And I'm going to create an event anytime someone views the page location contains blog. And if that page location was in the event that was the page view, then create this new event called blog view. And that's why you see in my events report, there's this new event called blog view. So what happens is Google Tag Manager fires my page view tag or my global event tag. And then GA4 actually then fires another tag actually from the client. It creates its own new event for blog when those conditions are met. And then you can come in and mark that as a conversion. So if we were to go back into the conversion migration tool, that's effectively how that feature works. It pulls your settings from your universal, gives you the ability to define what you want to be the conversion, and then it's going to try and use this create event feature to inject the event so that you don't have to go into Google Tag Manager and potentially retag everything. Personally, I'm probably never going to use that feature because I'm likely going to go into Google Tag Manager and set up my own conversions manually, just because I feel like that's probably going to be more scalable. But for anyone that wanted like a really quick, easy way to do something super fast, then that goal migration tool might be useful for you. But for anyone that considers themselves more of an intermediate or advanced user, I'm guessing it's likely something that you won't need.
I like it. I think it's really awesome. Can you send these events in BigQuery, and let's say you connect BigQuery to your other, this reminds me of email marketing. I do email marketing and I work with tools and I work only with events. So for instance, like with CXL, we have this segments that are people that join foundations, but they didn't fill out the registration, or people that bought your course but also bought something else. And for those people, we trigger a different, behavior on the website and also in email, which is kind of similar. Like we're using different parameters with different events.
But now you're getting into like a different feature. So if you liked this one, so this has nothing to do with like conversion imports. This custom event feature is just something you can use to create manual conversions. And I showed you that the goal conversion uses this, but let's talk about what you just mentioned. So basically you're saying I would create all of these conditions that are pretty much at an audience level, and I would use those. So in GA4, you have the ability to create audiences off of whatever you want. And this is probably my favorite feature to demo. So here's an example where I have an audience and I said, show me anyone that views my blog. And within 10 minutes, they viewed or submitted my contact form. You could customize this to be whatever you want. And this is highlighting two things. First of all, we can do things with time that you could never do before in Universal, because we can create audiences or do analysis between interactions or events. And you can't do that in Universal. And here I'm creating a sequence. So I'm saying, show me someone that started checkout and completed checkout within 6 minutes. And the cool part is on the right-hand side, there's this new feature called audience triggers. And what this does is you can actually tell GA4 to create an event when a user meets the audience conditions. Now, why would you want it to create an event? Well, because by creating that as an event, you can actually go into your events report, and here's that event. So these are all 49 times that these 49 or 43 users met those conditions. You can say to mark it as a conversion. So you're actually now having the ability to create audience-based conversions. And then for your question, all of these events, so those blog views that I created and these audience events that I created, which are basically happening from the GA4 UI, all show up in BigQuery. They all show up in the UI. So you can do whatever you want with these, both for analysis, for conversions, for audiences, for bidding, or for marketing activation in Google Cloud or wherever else you want to hook up those events to. So all of that is now possible in GA4 and was not functionality we really had in Universal at all.
Yeah, I think this is my favorite one so far because this is what I do. I work with this enterprise email platform, which is not like Klaviyo, it's not like MailChimp, like it's very difficult and it works only on events, liquid JavaScript, and like branching. So I have to create these events in WordPress and send them to the CDP, and the CDP sends them to the email. So you just have like, this is like, I think really exciting for, especially for e-commerce marketers that are dealing with a lot of consumers that are performing more or less kind of the same things. This is a great way, I think, in my
Oh,
opinion.
yeah. So like if we think about conversion tracking for e-commerce, for the last 15 years, we've pretty much only tracked transactions as a conversion. And maybe if you implemented a bunch of events, you might track like a certain product that you cared about, or maybe, you know, something a little bit more sophisticated. But the point is, at the core of it, we've only really been measuring the transaction as the conversion. There's nothing more sophisticated. So what can you do with GA4? Well, exactly to your point, right now, what about conversions for customers that spend more than $50? What about for conversions for customers in a particular target market where you're launching a new business or opening a new store? What about conversions for customers who purchase two particular product categories? So maybe you're trying to sell bundled products or try and sell related products, and that's a huge goal for your business this year. All these different types of conversions you can now create for the first time ever. And then in addition, another just fun feature to highlight is if we go into the explore section, assuming I can find it, in the explore section of GA4, we should have the ability to also leverage new predictive audiences. So a lot of marketers don't necessarily have the ability to have a data science team who can do all this sort of advanced analysis to predict who's likely to convert or not likely to convert. So baked into GA4 now, primarily for ecom, is you can also have these audiences built on the fly. So if you measure a purchase, Google will actually potentially give you the ability to have automatic predictions over who's likely to purchase in the next 7 days. And you can actually customize these. So you can say, well, what is your definition of likelihood? Is it 90% likely? Or is it 70% likely or something like that? Or who's the least likely to purchase? So if you're thinking about why this would matter, well, if you're a small business, it means you only have a limited amount of ad budget that you can spend on something like Google Ads. And Google will take all of your budget, right? And your job is to be as effective as you can with your limited ad budget. So one way to use this is instead of just remarketing to every user the same, what if you changed it and you remarketed to someone, you know, who is 50 to 80% likely to convert? Because if they're 80% or higher, they likely don't need a remarketing campaign. They're going to convert no matter what. So what if we try to trim down our budget and focus on those that are somewhat likely to convert? So anyways, all of these new possibilities at an audience level or conversion or kind of the attribution or measurement perspective are all now baked into GA4, which I'm pretty excited about to see what kind of comes next.
I think it's also really interesting because having the time component in GA4 can also unlock you doing transactional data analysis because you use the time as the recency, you can use frequency as a goal, and then you use, you know, the actual amount as the monetary value, and you can actually end up doing RFM analysis from GA4, which I think is fantastic because then you have those segments and then, you know, you are able to do a lot of, you know, cool complex stuff and not do them in Excel like how I did the RFM in Excel. This,
Yes, exactly.
yeah, this is really mind-blowing. Like I like this. I hope we get to finish our integration soon because this is something that for us is really important. Oh my God. Okay, because still have some questions for you. Let's see. So we have Muhammad Ali from InOcean USA, and he's asking you, he's actually part of the Measure Slack. He said, is the Google Signals data all that impressive?
So Google Signals, I think, could be impressive. Right now, I struggle with it a little bit personally. So Google Signals is basically what I would say is kind of Google's cross-device or identity graph. So Google users who have agreed to share data with Google, if you also share data with Google, then Google can do two things with Google Signals. First of all, they can use it to do cross-device remarketing. So that's kind of what powers that cross-device remarketing in Google Ads. And then the other component is that you can potentially use as the default reporting identity in GA4. So you can, if you don't, the benefit of this is if you have a website where you don't have a lot of people that authenticate or log in, meaning you don't know who they are and they're not telling you who they are, potentially something like Google Signals is going to give you the best ability to kind of understand and track them across their different devices and browsers at an anonymous lens. Now, the challenge right now is if we look at how this works, there's only two different reporting identities. You could either look at the anonymous, or basically the cookie, or we look at this blended. So it does by user ID, then Google Signals, and then device. And right now, I'm finding a lot of customers are having challenges with this. And that's because if you use Google Signals, what's going to happen is it's going to apply different privacy components or what we call data thresholds. So what is data thresholds? Well, we can see what happens. So if I go in and I save this, so this is something cool. You can save and change this all day long. It's retroactive, meaning it's query time. So I'm not going to permanently change any of my data by saying I want to use this new identity approach. But what I want to show you is that when I changed it, now every report I go to has this orange triangle, and it says that thresholding is being applied. And that's what this article is about. So basically what happens is Google's not going to let you get user level data out about users that have Google Signals being applied to them. So things with like low rows, it might hide that data, again, in order to basically protect privacy. So I sometimes see people on Measure Slack and other places struggle because they're like, hey, I went to my events report and one of my events is now missing, or the data is slightly different. And that's almost always happening because of this particular setting where Google's trying to preserve privacy. So personally, for me, I do one of two things. I try and not use Google Signals right now because I haven't seen a lot of like case studies or anyone that's really published about how much more effective or accurate their data is with using something like Google Signals. So my preference right now is to do device ID only. And in addition, I don't want my rows to sometimes disappear. So the other thing is I'm hoping Google changes this as a feature update because I think we as marketers should have the ability to use user ID and the device ID, but not use Google Signals when it's integrated. So simply, I hope Google gives us the ability to use something like Google Signals for remarketing, but not necessarily have it tied in to our reporting identity. And that's something that's not possible right now. So either you just remove Google Signals entirely so that you can use your user IDs, or you don't use either of these and you use device ID only. So this is a long way of saying I'm not really sure about Google Signals at this. I'm really wanting that new functionality to not have it affect my default reports. But right now, that's not exactly how it works. So likely, it's something we'll probably want to give Google a little bit more time and kind of see what happens with changing this.
Cool, thank you. And we had an announcement today, and the new privacy controls from Google Analytics 4 landed, and IP addresses are no longer being logged among other things. So related to this announcement, how does this affect everything that we just talked about? But also, would this affect basically having the client ID stored in the cookie, for example?
Yeah, so these announcements just shipped. I think like 1 a.m. I was trying to go to sleep and then
I saw you. Yeah, I was like, Charles is not sleeping today.
it got me. There's never sleep in the analytics world. So this announcement is in relation to a number of rulings in the EU where Google's trying to give marketers more control to try and comply with various regulations and changes that are happening. So Google has made some changes where it's now explicitly not logging IP addresses. So it's ensuring that it's receiving and processing everything in the EU, and that the IP address isn't stored, so that it's doing its geo lookups ahead of time. And then in addition, it's giving us new controls. So we just talked about Google Signals. For the first time, we can now enable or disable it at a regional level. And then also at a regional level, we can determine certain metadata about the user, whether we're going to track it or not track it. And if we look at this, I think historically some of these dimensions could potentially be used for fingerprinting users, and Google's now giving you the ability to not collect those, so you can have a more anonymous view of those users if you needed. So I feel like this is a huge step in the right direction. Personally, I'm hoping we get even more from Google. So I'm hoping we get new features around being able to choose where we store the data at a regional level. I'm hoping we get new features for like SSO, so we can start managing and controlling better who has access to our Google Analytics and other products. I'm also hoping Simo, I think, and Rick, I think Dronker has posted that they're also hoping we get more control around this over other data. So for example, right now, GA4 doesn't really give you the ability to not use transaction IDs or to not use other certain user identifiers like the user ID dimension itself. So this is a nice start, but I feel like we need even more flexibility to provide even more tight controls and anonymizations of users when we might want to do it. So it's exciting. Again, it's really good. We're seeing Google move in this direction. And my hope is that we see even more functionality around this soon.
This is really cool. Yeah, and more flexibility so people can actually, be able to. I think it's a good direction. And I told you I was reading you in the morning and I was like, wow, Charles is not sleeping. He's a bot. I'm really sure he's a bot. It's tweeting this. It was funny. We have like 6 more minutes, and I want to. This was like one of the most asked questions. Like, can you give us the too long didn't read version of the BigQuery, the infamous BigQuery integration, and like how I like to the idea of your own personal CDP.
Yeah, and I do have a little bit more time if we do need to go over, but for BigQuery, I think the too long didn't read was what we have here is, first of all, this feature exists. So it didn't exist in Universal unless you are on the paid version. And what this meant was that basically the way I would frame it, you couldn't really do advanced analysis in Google Analytics if you are on the free version. And that's because to do advanced analysis, you really need access to the raw data. Advanced analysis is where you're normally getting in and trying to do things that are above and beyond what the UI can do. Maybe we're trying to build our own predictions, our own customer lifetime value. Maybe we want to go in and we want to do custom pathing, or we want to hook it up with Tableau or Looker or something else that our data science team or our marketing team prefers to use. And again, that was really restricted and not something that you could have. So in GA4, simply we have a BigQuery integration. So everyone can come in, they can use BigQuery. And the exciting part is because BigQuery is built to store massive amounts of data that are infinitely larger than anything you could probably do with GA4, the cost tends to be fairly small, especially as you get started. And on the BigQuery side, this just opens up, again, the ability for you to pretty much do anything and everything. So if I go over to BigQuery, over here, we have all of the data. It's important that you probably set this up as soon as possible because it only collects data from when you turn on this feature forward. It doesn't backfill. But in here, we can just simply see real quickly, we have all the data that's happening. So all the events, all the parameters, and there's certain people, I think like Simo, who have told me they don't use the UI of GA4 at all. They actually do everything with this BigQuery data because they prefer it. They find it more flexible. They find it more powerful. You can integrate it with the other platforms. You can really take full control over it. So this is opening up advanced analytics to the masses. And that's really what's so exciting about this particular feature.
I'm very excited about using this. I told you I'm doing SQL courses, and this is great for me. Like, this is gonna be, and I think, like, I think for people that wanna like get their feet wet, can we use like sample data and test this with the current setup?
Yeah, so there's two ways. So for sample data, my best recommendation is just use it on your own account. So as long as you have some tag or some GA4 property, you can have real data. But if you really wanted sample data, then that's something GA4, I think, released late last year. So there's a brand new sample data set for BigQuery. You can connect this. I think it connects to the sandbox. So you get free queries and storage. I don't even think you have to put a credit card to start playing around. But the short answer there is absolutely. And then Google's got some sample queries. I'm sure CXL will have some great resources on this in the future. And I know others in the community like Simo have some great stuff too. So there's definitely ways to play around with this for sure.
This is really cool. So, like, is there anything that now I finished the questions that I had from the audience. I just wanted to ask you if there's anything like you want to share that you're really, really excited about that we didn't talk about and we didn't cover in this episode.
So things I'm really excited about. I would say the other one that I'm really optimistic about is my hope is that the UI of GA4 can be something that's really special. And I think some of you know that, and we I think we hinted on this a little bit earlier, but for the first time, we can come in and we can customize like our left-hand nav. So we've never been able to change that in GA4 before. And you can do that at both the nav, you can create new sections. So you could create like SEO, SEM, blog, content. But what I hope happens is like, if Google gives us the ability to do that at a user level, so we could have a different user experience for different groups of users, I start to think that that could be really special. And then additionally, right now, the customization is fairly limited. So you can't filter any of the reports. So I couldn't say, well, in the content report, only show me my blog content. We can't filter it. It only shows you all of the content. So if Google adds filters and the ability to do user groups, I think this opportunity where we can curate custom experiences of GA4 for different groups of users is something that could be really special. And then the other thing I would say that I'm really hoping happens is I feel like we haven't had a lot of updates to explorations in quite some time. This is where Google's added lots of new dimensions, but I don't feel like they've added a lot of features to the existing reports or even new capabilities at all. So there's some really exciting stuff in here, like you could do funnels for the first time. You can do backwards and forwards pathing, so figure out a conversion and work backwards. But my hope is that we start to get some really exciting functionality here to start letting us do, again, a lot of advanced analysis in a way where we don't need BigQuery and we don't need SQL, because it's important, I think, for Google to remember that BigQuery isn't an option for everyone, right? For a variety of reasons. So having something that can start to do some really powerful analysis, like in here, I would love to know, as an example, what the percentage of each row is of the total, so I can determine what percentage of my traffic is coming from New York. And right now that's a little bit challenging to do. So anyways, it's a long way of me just saying, I have lots of feature requests for Google if anyone wants to take me up on those. And I'm hoping that we get a lot of that in the platform, because I feel like if we can start changing this conversation, and instead of saying, how does universal compare to GA4 from a feature comparison, and we can just start this new category, like here's 30 things that you could never do before that we can do because of GA4 and because of everything that's happened. I think it'll make it a lot easier for marketers to maybe remove some of that fear and uncertainty and doubt that we're currently experiencing. And instead, we can start focusing on the net positives and the improvements and just a lot of the power and potential this platform has. So I hope, since we're still early, Google said we have till July of next year before it starts going, that we'll start seeing a lot of that come. So that's my I guess, two features is explorations and the standard reports and the potential behind them.
Thank you. This is really cool. And this was a great overall demo. Thank you so much for taking the time to do it. And I'm going to share all these helpful links that you mentioned throughout the recording in the description. And yeah, I'm excited to see what's coming. And the one thing that I'm really excited about and I want to see more is the COV part and the segmentation and the predictive lifetime value, like all those things, that the retention part of GA4. It's something that really excites me. And I think once that is just, like, is going to be improved, I think it's really like going to be very, I don't know, hard for other tools to compete with what, GA4 can ultimately do. And that retention piece is something really exciting for me. So yeah, I'm just, as you, like just reading Twitter one day at a time. And thank you. Thank you again. This was great, Charles.
My pleasure. Let's do it again soon.
Hell yeah.